So now we're going to look at 3.3, which is entitled Mixing It Up, Looking at Ratios, Rates, Percents, and Proportions. And for this problem set, we're looking at chimp food recipes. Now you notice there are recipes for adult chimps, and there are also recipes for baby chimps. Now this recipe, it just tells you the percentage of high fiber versus high protein. Adults, you might find this funny, but adults are going to need more fiber than protein, and kids are going to need more protein than fiber. Okay? So it tells you how much of their diets needs to consist of those two things. And there's different high fiber, high protein foods that you need to mix together in order to feed them. Now, if we take a look at the first one, it says copy and complete the table to find the unit rates for the baby chip mix. All right, so go ahead and copy this in your notes. Go and copy this thing in your notes and then come back to the video to see how you did. So my hint for you here is to set up proportions for each one of these. Okay, so if you're struggling getting started, let's set up the proportions. So this is for baby food. And if you look back at the baby food, they need right here 40% fiber, 60% high protein. All right, so the high fiber, this is going to be 40%, and the high protein, that's going to be 60% is what they're going to need. So when we set up our proportion, you know that they're going to have 1 scoop of high fiber, which consists of 40%. And then we don't know how many. This is what we're trying to find. So let's put our variable there. And let's use high protein. So let's use a P. But we know that needs to be consistent to the recipe, which is 60%. Then from here, you can cross multiply and solve. So if you haven't already, go ahead and find all of the unknowns here and then come back to the video. Okay, so when we cross multiply, you would have 40p is equal to 60 times 1 is just 60, but we need to get p by itself. So 40 times what number will give us 60? Divide out that 40. And so p has to be 60 over 40, because those will cancel, or 6/4, or 3/2. But I would say 1.5, because to answer the question here, you're trying to figure out how many scoops. You would need 1.5 scoops there. And then the total scoops, you would just add those to get together, and you would have 2.5. Okay, for the other two, you set up your proportions, and you should have gotten, again, 2/3 here, setting up your proportion, which makes sense, because these two are going to be reciprocals. So this is 3/2, so that's going to be 2/3. And then the last one, you would add these together. That would be 1 2/3. And then for this one, you can set a proportion, that's fine, but you can actually think through this one, right? Because if you have 100 scoops and 40% is supposed to be fiber, 60% protein, well, then you know that 40 scoops of fiber and 60 scoops of protein on that one. So now let's take a look at number 2, writing two equations relating the number of scoops of high protein, F, and the number of scoops. And there's actually 2 different answers you could get here. So you're looking to define the relationships here, right? An equation that defines the relationship that if I plug in 40 for the number of scoops, I'll get 60. If I plug in 2/3 for the number of scoops of the high fiber, I will get 1 for the number of scoops of high protein. Right, and this is important because if you are treating thousands or feeding thousands of animals and all of them are different, then you don't want to have to figure those out individually. You want to have just a formula or an equation that you can just plug it in and easily find out how much of each food that you're going to give these dogs or animals, whatever they are. So go ahead and try to write 2 equations. One for what you're going to do. The first one would be something like F equals the amount of high fiber would equal, and the other one would be P equals. Pause the video, try that, and then come back and see how you did. So you should have F is equal to 2/3 P, And that could be easily seen right here. That row right there, or that column. And then P would be 3/2 F. So that's a P. All right, so those are our two equations for number 2. Okay, on number 3A, it says Ming uses 48 scoops of high-protein food in one batch. How many scoops of fiber? So for these, you are using these equations that we just made. So you're going to be using those equations to answer these questions. For all of A, B, and C, go ahead and try number 3 on your own, and then come back and see how you did. Okay, on part A, it says Ming uses 48 scoops of high protein. How many scoops of high fiber? So let's use these equations. So we want to know how many scoops of high fiber. So that would be 2/3 times the scoops of high protein. So that would be 48. And so the number of scoops would be 32 scoops or cups of the high fiber for part A. And explaining our reasoning, we just used the equation, right? And since we wanted to know how much of the high fiber, and we already know the protein, then we would use the first one. And then for the second one, our part B, it says Ming uses a batch. Let's use a different color, blue. Ming uses a batch of baby food with a total of 125. So the total is 125 scoops, and we want to know how many scoops of high fiber. Well, high fiber, remember, that's to make up 40%. So if we have 125, we're going to find 40% of 125, and then that should give us 50 scoops or cups for the high fiber. And then part C, what's another way to solve these problems? Well, you could set up proportions. Like if we set up proportions for, let's take, for example, this first one. Let's say we didn't have the equations. Well, we could set up a proportion, because if we know we're using 48 scoops of high protein, which makes up 60% of their diet, how many scoops of high fiber? Well, that would be, we don't know what this is, but we know that it makes up 40%. And when we cross multiply, 60F is equal to 48 times 40. When you divide out that 60, look, 40 over 60, that's 2/3. So you're going to end up taking 2/3 times 48, which still gives you 32 cups or scoops. Okay, so for both of those, you could set up proportions to solve for those. Now let's take a look at part B. Some new chimps arrive at the zoo. Ming had already mixed 20 scoops of high fiber, so I'm going to highlight that. 20 scoops of high fiber and 30 scoops of high protein. She finds out that the new chimps are adults. Adult chimps need food that has more fiber. Okay, so then it says Ming needs to add more high fiber food to the mix she already has. She uses information on the previous page to adjust it. So now you're using the formula for the adults, meaning they need 60% high fiber, 40% high protein. So we're going to have to answer the questions on 1 and 2 to figure out what do we need to do to change that mix so that's the correct amount for those chimps. Go ahead and try B1 and 2 on your own, and then come back to the video to see how you did. So if we take a look at number 1, Ming needs to add more high fiber. So she's already added 30 scoops of high protein food. So we don't know how much more fiber that we're going to need to add. So let's set up a proportion, right? The easiest way to do that. Well, if you think about the relationship between high fiber and high protein, so you know that fiber to protein for these adults is 60 to 40. Okay, well, let's say we know that she put in how many? 30 scoops of high protein. So let's plug that in there. So then if we solve this proportion, we cross multiply and solve this proportion, that's going to tell us how much fiber in total should be in this mix. So if we do this, you would have 40F is equal to 60 times 30. Divide out that 40. And when you do that, you would get F is equal to 45. So for this mix that we have, in order for it to be what the adults need, 45 scoops need to be of the fiber if 30 of them are protein, which 30 of them are. But we've already added the 20 scoops, and so really you just need 25 more of the fiber. On number 2, again, if you haven't done this, make sure you go back and try this on your own. Her original mix had 20 scoops. What percentage is that increase? Well, it increased by 25%, or 25 scoops, right? Increased by 25 scoops. So we need to figure out what percentage is 25 of 20. Well, we know it's more than 100%. Okay, and you can actually find that if you just take 25 over 20 and you get 1.25 or 125% for number 2. Go ahead and try C on your own. Read through it, understand it, and try C on your own with that graph. Again, okay, on C, how do you know the graph matches the equations? Probably the easiest way is to plug values in. Like, for example, we already have a value here on the graph right here. This is 45. If you go straight up and then straight over, our protein should be at 30 scoops. So let's test it. If we test this, P should be equal to 2/3 of F. So if we know that the high fiber is at 45, so 2/3 of 45, that should be 30, because that's what our graph shows, when in fact it is. So if you take 2/3 of 45, it matches. You can also look at this, plug 60 in there. So it'd be 60 times 2/3, that gives you 40, which then matches up. So that is number 1. That's how we can show that it actually fits this equation. And then number 2, how can you use the graph to answer the questions in part B above? That's up here. Well, again, if you know how much fiber or protein, you just follow the graph. So we did on here, if we knew that there's going to be 60 cups for the fiber, just follow that up to your line, and then from your line go straight over to your other axes to figure out how much protein you would use. So you would use 40 and 60, and we could even do it here. If we have 30 go up, we would need then 20 cups of the high protein. And again, this is for the adult chimp mix. Okay, on D, number 1, it says Ming wants to use a unit rate to find out how many more scoops of high fiber food to add, and she writes this proportion. She also says that 60% to 40% is equal to the rate of 1.5. Is she correct? Explain. So go ahead and answer D 1, 2, 3, and 4, working with the percentages, and we've been doing proportions this whole time, so this shouldn't be too bad for you, but try to answer these on your own and then come back to the video to see how you did. Okay, so on the first one, is that 1.5 unit rate correct? Yes, it is, because if you take 60 divided by 40, that's equivalent to a 1.5 as a decimal. Number 2 replaces 60% of 40% with the rate of 1.5. So what she did is she simplified this to just 1.5. So now this is your proportion or equation. And then 3, what would be Ming's first step in solving? So for us, the first thing we would do, we've done this many times, is we would cross multiply. That would be the first thing we would do. And then in the last one, we're going to actually go through and solve it. So if you haven't tried this one on your own, try it on your own and then come back to the video. But when we cross multiply, you would have x times 2.2 is equal to 4.24 times 6.82. And we want to figure out what number times 2.2 will give me this. So I divide that out. We do the opposite. And when we do that, you get x is equal to 45. And we can always check this by plugging it back in up here. If it's right, then when we take 45 divided by 4.24 and 6.82 divided by 2.2, you'll get the same thing. And in fact, check that in your calculator. 45 divided by 4.24 and 6.82 divided by 2.2, you should get the same thing. And if you actually did that, you would find out that you did not get the same thing. Kudos to you. So 45 is not the right answer there. And in fact, our answer should have been, and if you want to round it, you can round it, but 13.14. Now, when you take that and plug it in, so now we're going to take this and plug it in. So now when you take 13.14 divided by 4.24, that should be equivalent to 6.82 over 2.2. Now it might be just a little bit off because we actually had to round this because I think there's another 4 there, but they're going to be extremely close, if not exact, if you plug in the whole number there. Okay, so that's how you can always check to make sure your answer is right. That's why algebra is so amazing. You can always check your answers before you turn in your test, if, again, you know how to do that. That is all that I have for 3.3, looking at mixing it up, connecting ratios, rates, percents, and proportions.